Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, How to Build a High-Performance Grid Application Using ReExt. My name is Mark Guzmano. I am a sales engineer at Sencha and also the creator of ReExt. And I'm very excited to do this webinar today with you guys. And I'm also very pleased and thankful for all of the feedback, very positive feedback we've gotten about ReExt, and I've worked with many of you to get your ReExt projects going. So continue to do that. You see my email address on the bottom of the screen. I'll also share it on the last screen for our Q&A session. I'd love to hear what you're trying to do or doing. I'd love to be there to give you any insight and help. And one of the things, of course, if you're building with ReExt is to build high-performant data-centric applications, and that most likely involves the grid. So that's why we're going to talk about that in this webinar. So in this webinar, again, focused on the ReExt grid, we'll talk about how you use that grid in a quote-unquote big data scenario. When you have a lot of data that you want to show in a grid, you want to give your users what we call an infinite scrolling experience. You want them to feel like it's a grid with all the data they need right there. You may not want to provide them with a paging toolbar, although you could, but you want to give them that natural experience. So we're going to talk about how you do that and how the grid performs and gives you performance benefits by using certain aspects of the grid. Those aspects are things like virtual rendering, the ability to scroll down in a grid and have the grid automatically only have certain rows or items in the DOM, in the browser DOM, which greatly enhances performance. We'll also talk about a buffered store, the ability to get just the data you need to be able to provide for what the user is looking for. And this will become obvious as we go through the demo here. We'll also talk a little bit about other aspects of a grid when you're using these techniques, how you filter, how you sort, how you make group items. Because as you'll see, when we do this, this virtual rendering, we don't have all the data necessarily on the client. So how do you do these things if the data is substantially not on the client and mostly on the server? So we'll talk about all this in the context of best practices, how you build scalable grid applications, how you use ReExt, a few tips and tricks about React, which is the environment that we're using. So looking forward to this being a very productive webinar. Let me also make mention that we will take questions and answers at the end, and to get your question in, there is a questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to type those questions in at any point. Once we're done with the presentation, I'll turn it over to our team and we'll go through each question and hopefully be able to answer all of them. If not, or if you come up with something after the webinar, please use my email and send me that question and I'd be happy to talk with you. Okay, so we're going to talk about building performant grid applications in ReExt, but ReExt is a relatively new offering from Sencha. So I want to talk about what ReExt is and also begin the process of creating a ReExt application so that we can bring in the aspects of a grid that you would take advantage of when you were building this ReExt application. So we'll create a starter application. I'll use the documentation that's available for ReExt on NPM. ReExt is an NPM package. And we'll create that page, and then we'll look at some of the performance characteristics of using a grid with a lot of data. And we'll talk about some of the trade-offs. What are the balances that you have to go through in creating a not too chatty grid, not going to get data all the time, but also a very high performant grid so that a user can scroll through and see data instantly. So all of that will be introducing a concept called the buffered store. And we'll get to that as we get through the discussion here. So first off, what is ReExt? Well, ReExt is a React library. So it runs under the React framework, the React library. And it gives you the ability to use the Sencha EXTJS components in React. It's a very simple idea. It is actually one component. The component is called ReExt. It has 5 props, and then it has event props. The props give it the characteristics that it needs. So for example, X-type is probably the most important prop. And those of you who've used EXTJS know that X-type defines the type of component you want, whether that be a button, a grid, a tree view. You can also specify styling with class name and the style prop. The big workhorse prop is config. Config are all the elements that you want to configure for the X type that you've selected. So in the bottom on the screen, you see that I'm creating a ReExt component. The X type is a button. I have class name and style, but I haven't filled it in with anything. You don't have to fill those in. But the config is where I set the properties or the configs for an X type of button. In this particular case, very simple, just setting text and a width. There are event properties, and any event that that particular component can handle will be represented with the on and then the name of the event. So there's a click event, so on click. There was a select event, on select. ON is always small letters, and then the first letter is capitalized. So as you can see in here, on click is the one event I'm using in this example. There's one special event called ready that just tells you when the underlying EXTJS component is available, and it will give you that component as an object. So if you want to use direct calls to that component within your React application, you're free to do so. So that gives you basically the flavor of everything that you can do to create a ReExt component. Now, a button, admittedly, is very simple, but it's very useful to be able to provide event handlers. We're going to look at a grid and a little more complexity around how you would configure that grid, but the style of creating it is still the same. X type of grid, a config element with whatever element, whatever props need to be there, columns, data, things like that, store. So we'll look at that. The way that you acquire the grid and everything else within ReExt is going to the public NPM page. You can also go to the Sencha site. There is a link where you can go to register and be able to download the NPM component. But I'm going to just show you the NPM site. And you can see here I'm on npm.js, which is the node package manager. And I've gone to the @Sencha/ReExt package. So this is the package that is used for ReExt. Just like any other component or any other package in NPM, you install it with a simple npm-i or npm install. And we'll go through that process here momentarily. And probably a few other things to note on this page is that there's quite a bit of documentation and links to examples and quick starts and information about acquiring a version of XJS, et cetera, et cetera. So this table of contents will get you to any of those particular areas. The area that I'd like to go to begin with is this step-by-step guide. Well, actually, I'm going to go to this quick start. But let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to do first. So it's very easy to get started with ReExt. And we're living in the React ecosystem. So nowadays, probably the most popular way to create a React starter application is with the tool called Vite, V-I-T-E. And so what we've done is we've created a few steps to get you started with a Vite React application. You can see here we're doing an npm create Vite. So we'll use the latest version of Vite. I'm going to give it a project name. I'm going to call it ReExt Vite. And then you have a bunch of templates you can use. And we'll just use the React template. After that, that will actually create a ReExt Vite folder. We're going to CD into that folder and then npm install the ReExt component. By doing an npm install of the ReExt component, we're going to install everything else we need, React and anything else that Vite might want to put there. So we'll be ready to go. One last thing we'll do just to get you up and running quickly is we're going to do 3 copies. We're going to copy a new Vite config file. We're going to copy an app.jsx, which is the starting page or the starting component in your application. And then we're going to copy main.jsx. Main is that is the starting code for a typical Vite application. Then we're just open that application in a browser. So it's really nice that you can take all of these. I'm just going to copy them all from the quick start and bring it to a terminal window. Just paste it in and hit enter. So this is going to do all of those steps at one time. So the first step is really quickly. It just scaffolded a project. Then it does an npm install. And remember, I said the npm install will install everything in addition to the ReExt component. And then we copied a couple files and then started the test web server. So you can see in under a minute, definitely under a minute, we've got a running React ReExt environment. And it's admittedly simple and purposefully so. We've got a little logo up here to tell you what's going on, the fact that we're using this version of ReExt, and we're at version 18 of React, EXTJS at the latest version, which is 7.8. We're using the classic toolkit and the classic theme of the underlying EXTJS components. And then down here, we've got a handful of components. We've got a button, got a grid. If I click on any one of these rows, there's an event handler for that click, and I have 3 display fields. So very simple. I can do sorting. That's what gets us started. And that's a nice place to start. Everything's kind of in place. We've got a trial version of EXTJS while we're looking at the product. Ultimately, you'll want to convert that to a production licensed version, but we can go ahead and get started with development right here and there. So these set of steps are what we just went through. Very simple, very easy, and right on the npm package page. Okay, before we take the next step, let me go ahead and stop the running server and go ahead and go into the editor environment that I use to see what was created. So you can see here, I'm in the ReExt Vite folder. I use the Visual Studio Code editor. And so you can see here, I'll make this a little bit more part of the page. You can see here that we have a typical created page. Here's the ReExt config file. Here's the root index.html. You'll notice that it has a div with a root of with an ID of root. That's typically how a React application gets started. It says that we're going to start out in the main.jsx file under the source folder. Here is that file. You'll notice this folder has a few ReExt things in it. It has something called a ReExt provider. So a provider in a React environment is something that runs and kind of envelops the rest of your application. And in this case, this ReExt provider is being fed ReExt data to say which SDK are we using, what version, are we using any of the advanced EXTJS packages like charts or calendar or D3 visualization integration, things like that. And then ultimately we start out with our first visual component, which is the app component. So if I go over here, you'll notice that this app component now includes a ReExt import. So ReExt is that component I mentioned, and that is what gives us all the ability to do the creation of any X type we want. So down here, just to take a look, here's a ReExt button. Here's a ReExt grid. So from here, on down, so right here. And you'll notice those props that I mentioned. This one happens to use style. Here's the config prop for a grid. I'll come back to that. And here's one event that I cared about, on select, which is the select event of a grid. Going back up to the config here, you'll notice that I'm setting configs specific to the X type of grid. The ones most notable are columns and store. Again, those of you familiar with EXTJS, those should be very familiar concepts. A store is the way you configure data access and data acquisition. In this very simple example, it's just a memory store. So it's not very exciting, but it does get the job done. And you'll notice here that I have inline data. That's not typically how you would do something, but it is a good way to get started. So let's augment this a little bit. Let me bring up an example here and bring it into the project. So this is another component that I happen to call Big Data Local. So this component also uses ReExt. It uses a couple of helper components, which just wrap the ReExt component, but a ReExt grid and a ReExt display field. We'll see how that works in a minute here. And this is what we're going to use to demonstrate some of the performance features. So I want to use Big Data Local as my starting component. So to do that, I'm going to come up here and import the Big Data component or Big Data Local component. So there's my import, and then I merely have to change the component, the root component that's going to be called here to be Big Data Local. I'm going to bring up a terminal window right inside Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go ahead and restart the Vite development server, which is npx vite -open. When we do this, and there's our new page, the Big Data Local page, now with a substantially different grid. This grid actually has a number of rows, 50,000 rows in this particular case. I have a click event or a select event where as I select each item, I am filling in the details here. So this is very similar to the default page that comes up, although I've augmented the grid quite a bit so that we can see, what's happening when we're starting to build the application. I'm going to hit F12 here and just bring up the Chrome developer tools and show you that if you use some of the React tools that exist in the ecosystem, there are some tools for components and profiling. If I bring up components here, you can see that those tools recognize the ReExt component for the grid, the ReExt component for the display field, but you'll also notice a root component that kind of covers the ReExt component. So let's take a look at that just to get an understanding of what that is. So if I go back to the code window and bring up this new Big Data Local component, you'll see that it has these additional imports, ReExt grid and ReExt display field. Those aren't new pieces of functionality. Think of it as a wrapper around ReExt to make those particular components even more natural within React. So for example, here's ReExt grid, and instead of having a config object, I just have the columns config and the store config right on the ReExt grid component. So this should be very, very familiar to anybody who's done any work in React. So I have ReExt grid, I have a set of columns, and I have a store. But there's something very different about this store than the previous store that we were looking at. This one actually does not have inline data. It is using an AJAX proxy out to a database that's on Amazon that goes to get 50,000 users. And the store in this case is a buffered store. So that's what we're going to focus on. What is a buffered store? Why is it valuable for building high performant, big data, data-centric applications with the grid? So that's where we're heading. Just to complete what this page has, it simply has four, no, it has five. It has five ReExt display fields. And all a display field is just the field that is represented by these down here. So as I'm clicking on an item, you can see here that the display fields are changing. And the way that happens is through this event handler. So the onSelect event handler of the grid uses the onSelect function, and the onSelect function, which is up here, will set some state. So we're using local ReExt state to set this row field or this row constant. And as the row is set in state, you'll notice that there's some code in here that reacts to that state. So if the row changes, first name, row.first name is going to have a different value, and that's why the display field is changed. So a very natural experience from a React point of view. Okay, with all that being said, let's dive into performance of the grid. So if you have a grid that has 10, 100, 1,000, even a little bit more than that rows of data, you'll get away with just populating the grid with all the data. You probably have enough memory in your browser to handle all the data, and scrolling won't be that cumbersome or that non-performant because the browser can handle that. But what if you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of rows of data, and you want to present your data in a natural grid way? And what I mean by natural is you want to have a scroll bar, you want to be able to scroll through the data, you don't want to artificially have quote unquote pages. You want to be able to do that in an infinite grid way. It feels like all the data is in the grid. Well, the challenges are that you can only do that if you have performant elements in the grid. You really don't want to retrieve all the rows. If I'm sitting on this first page and I'm only showing the first 10 rows, I don't need all 49,990 other rows necessarily. I might need some, but I don't need them all. I also don't need to have all of those rows in the DOM, in the browser. I want those rows to be dynamic, and I only really need the rows that are visible, to be honest. And then you may or may not want to, as your user is scrolling between the pages of this grid, you may or may not want to retain all the old data that they looked at in memory, or maybe you want to retain some of it. Or you want to retain the one, a couple of pages before and a couple of pages after. So those are the kind of things that you have to balance if you're trying to write a highly performant grid. Fortunately, the ReExt grid handles all of that for you. And that's what I'm going to talk about, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate to you. So all of that happens with a concept of what we call the buffered store. So technically, a buffered store is a sparsely populated map of pages. So imagine your grid, if it shows 10 rows at a time, is a page of 10. So 50,000 rows is many, many pages of 10. So you don't necessarily have to have all those pages, but you want some of those pages. You certainly want the page you're on. You may want a few pages before and after. If the user takes the scroll bar and scrolls halfway to the middle of the grid, you want that page. So that's what we mean by sparsely populated. And extremely large server-side data sets is what this is built for. Now, I will argue that 50,000 rows in this world is not an extremely large server-side data set. It's large, but not extremely large. But it's just an example. Imagine this is your million-row parts inventory, or anything that you may have that has a lot of data. It would work similarly to what I'm showing you. So the idea is we want to give users the infinite scrolling effect. What does that mean? Well, if I go back to my grid here, remember this just has 50,000 rows in it. That's a good number. But watch what I can do here. I mean, I can scroll my mouse wheel and get very smooth scrolling, but watch, I can do this. I can scroll to the middle somewhere. Boom, instantaneously, I get to that page. You'll notice that I have an ID on each of these rows. So again, there are 50,000 rows, 0 to 49,999. And so you can kind of get an idea where I am here, right? So if I scroll anywhere in this page, and there is some latency from the AWS, but if I scroll anywhere in the middle of this page, it knows that roughly in the middle is row 21,000. And now I can start just scrolling in that general area. And you'll notice once in a while, I'll get a little wait dialog. That's when it's actually going to get data. So if I'm really close to where I'm at, you'll notice this is performing instantaneously. But if I keep scrolling down, every once in a while, it has to go get more data. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how that works and why it works and why it gives you this concept of an infinite scrolling, very highly performant grid. So all of these concepts regarding buffered store and this effect are documented in our EXTJS documentation. So since ReExt is right on top of the EXTJS components, the EXTJS documentation will give you all you need to know what properties and what events and what you might want to do with that particular component. So I'm on the documentation for the buffered store. And you can see here, it's got some of the words that I pulled off of this. It's the sparsely populated map, but it starts to talk about how the buffered store works and the fact that you have some knobs that you can turn or properties that you can set to control how your grid will work with your backend server-side data. So some of those things are page size, a trailing buffer zone, a leading buffer zone, a purge page count. So let me set the context of what I mean by that by going back to this grid and opening up the network tab. So let me open up the network tab and let me refresh this page. So you'll notice that in this refresh page, I'm on the fetch XSR button, which is all the interactions with the server. You'll notice that I had a single interaction with the server to a URL that has certain name value pairs associated with it. Page 1, start 0, limit 50. Watch as I start scrolling. As I start scrolling, as I get past 50, look what happened. Automatically, another call was made to the server, but this time it was to page 2. And if I scroll back, I don't have a retrieve of page 1. I might, if I keep scrolling like really long, I just keep scrolling. You can see I keep getting more and more pages. At some point when I scroll backwards, some of the pages that were there before may not be there anymore, but the grid knows how to take, well, actually more specifically, the store of the grid knows how to take, it has knowledge of what pages are in cache on the browser and will make the appropriate calls. But all the while, you'll notice your user, except for every once in a while, a loading indicator, which if you are fast enough in your server environment, you don't even need that loading indicator. But it feels to the user like this is an infinite grid. So this grid looks like it has 50,000 rows in it at all times, and I can go to anywhere I want within the grid. And you'll notice that, depending where I'm going, there may not be any interaction with the server. I go maybe to the middle here, I had a couple of calls. You are able to control elements of how this works. So those elements are the ones that I had on the slides and the ones that I want to highlight inside of this store. So notice I have a couple of configs for the store config. First off, notice that the type of store I have is a buffered store. And that is really the X type of a buffered store. So if you look at the alias here, it's alias store.buffered. So that is how I tell it, use a buffered store. I defined a page size. I said, get 50 rows at a time. I could get 20 rows at a time. I could get 100 rows at a time. This is where the trade-offs start. The more data you get at one time, the potentially longer it'll take to get that data, but the more data you get at one time, the less times you have to ask for data. And there's a happy medium there somewhere that is particular to your data set, to your characteristics. I can also specify whether data is prefetched. So if we go back to this component here, you'll notice that I only got one page because, or one set of 50, because I said I wanted 50 rows at a time. That's because I didn't set any of these to any particular value. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I can handle having more data on the initial load. If I do that, you'll notice I get a lot more data. So the trade-off there is it might have taken longer to get all that data, but now if I scroll back and forth, depending on where the data is, I'm pretty much having that data in cache. I also have a knob to turn to say whether I want to purge pages when we get to a certain level. So you can kind of see that these properties essentially control how much data you get, how often do you get data, how long do I keep it in the store, and I don't have to write any of that. I just tell the grid what to do, and it'll do it for me automatically. Now, one thing I do have to do is I do have to write my server-side code to handle these extra properties that are coming up to the server. So you'll notice this is my URL to the server, but if we look at the URLs that are actually being sent, they have this page, start, and limit parameter. So those are actually automatically put on your URL before it's sent to the server. And the reason it's done is that you want to be able to react to that on your server to say, oh, in this particular call, I should get page 8. Well, I know 50 pages at a time are, 50 rows at a time are being sent down. So 50 times 8, starts me somewhere. And in this particular case, I start at, 350 and I get the next 50 rows. So you kind of get the pattern here. So you have to write your API calls a little bit different. You have to have some parameters, but the benefit you get is tremendous. I mean, if this was 500,000 rows, I would essentially get the same performance because I'm only getting the rows I need subject to those properties that I set on the grid. So that's how this works from a retrieval of the data. The other question is, well, how does the grid know that there's 50,000 rows in the data? How does it know to show a toolbar that kind of represents, 10 out of 50,000? And how does it know when I go to the middle that that's roughly the middle? Well, the reason is there's another parameter that's sent in the payload or in the response with the data. You'll notice these are all the rows that are being sent back for this particular call, but then there's a total count. So that total count is what the grid uses to say, oh, okay, I realize there are 50,000 rows in the data. I realize I'm only showing 10. Let me size that elevator in the scroll bar accordingly. And as a user just randomly looks for a place to park, let me determine where that is roughly in the data. So we're in the 30,000s right now, and that seems about right. So that's how that particular element works. So one half of the infinite scrolling effect is controlling how the grid gets data. And again, it's documented in the EXT.js documentation. You have these variables and a few more that you can toggle. And as you see here, there is a URL that is being produced. Now, the names of page, start, and limit can be changed. There are actually configs to say, use the word, P instead of the word page for that first, and use S here, and you can use L here, or whatever you want. So there are additional configs that are documented to change the way this URL looks, but I just left the defaults here. Okay. As you saw, I can see the effect of this in the network tab. So I get the idea, and really your challenge is, what do you tweak those to? Are those, do you want a lot of data but fewer calls? Do you want fewer rows but maybe more calls? Do you want to, what's the characteristic of how the user uses the grid? Do they tend to just sequentially scroll through it, or do they hop around in certain places? And you'll be able to kind of start gauging, what the optimal performance is for that particular grid. And it could be different between grids. So network is probably the biggest one. The second one here is the DOM. So one of the things you don't want to do for a 50,000 or a 500,000 or even more grid is have all of those rows in the browser, in the DOM. So the other thing that the buffering does is it dynamically changes what's in the DOM. And it's probably easier to see this than for me to talk about it. So let me refresh this page again, but then let me inspect the browser, inspect the rows that are being created here. And so you see here that as I'm picking items in the DOM, it's highlighting individual rows, right? And you might find something strange. It's like, wow, that row is actually a table. Why is it a whole table? Why isn't it just a row? We've spent a lot of time performance tuning the DOM or the HTML that gets created for things like the grid to really make this thing as fast as possible. And it turns out a table is a more efficient way to show a row than maybe divs or other ways. But if I scroll down here, if I keep going down here, you'll notice that there are not 50,000 rows in the DOM. It stops right here at 42 in this particular case, right? Let me scroll a little bit and kind of just watch what happens. You kind of see, the DOM dynamically changing. So what the grid is doing is it's saying, okay, where am I? What rows do I need? What rows in the DOM do I not need? And it's just doing all that for you dynamically. You don't have to do a thing. It just does it for you. That would be very hard code to write. So the other aspect of infinite grid performance is keeping the DOM as small as reasonable. Now, you don't necessarily want to have only the records that are visible. As you notice in this particular one, there are some items that are below the visible area. But the idea is you want this to be performant, but you don't want it to be so performant that every time you scroll, you make a database call, right? So there's a trade-off, again, between how much buffer in front, how much buffer in back. And again, it's very specific to your use case. So that's the DOM. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how you can attain this infinite scrolling, very performant grid. And I will argue that the work you had to do, especially with ReExt giving you that great starter, is very, very minimal. It's creating your component, it's specifying the columns, it's specifying a store, in this particular case, a buffered store. It's setting these values, and some of these values are defaulted. So if you didn't want to have these values on here, if you just commented these all out, it would pick kind of a default set of properties. Let me just do that just to talk about what that is. So let's just say I didn't set any of those properties, and I just came over here and I went to the network tab and I refreshed. Well, in this case, it looks like it's set a limit of 25, and there's certain amount of data that it wanted to get beforehand. It looks like it got 10 sets of 25, so I could scroll down for a while, and it's making intelligent decisions on when to get more data. It's basically keeping that buffer ahead always filled in. So that's why I'm getting data, as I'm going forward. Now, I go backwards at some point, depending on what the defaults are. Some point, if I go backwards, it will have to get, and it just did it there, I will have to get new data. But again, that's the default. It's just picked some arbitrary values, but you have full control over exactly when it saves data, purges data, how much data it gets, and all of that is a set of props on the store, on the buffered store of ReExt grid. Okay. One other thing I want to talk about that I don't know if I have a slide for it, but just to make this complete, there is also an ability to do filtering, the ability to do sorting, the ability to do grouping. But how do you, let's take the sorting example. How do you sort? How is this thing sorting if the data is very sparse on the client? How is this thing figuring out that, you know, this row and this, I didn't have row 39,000 at the client, right? So in those particular cases, what you want to do is you want to do remote sorting, which is the default. So a buffered store will only sort correctly if remote sort is true, which again is the default. If I set this to false and I refresh this, nothing, right? It can't do local sorting. It doesn't have all the data. How does it, you know, to sort just the 10 records that you see in front of you, it does not make sense. What the user expects is store all the data. So that's just one other aspect, is sorting and filtering and grouping. So keep those things in mind as you're building your buffered store application. Okay. How do you get started on this stuff? How do you start playing with this? How do you start really maybe taking advantage of some of this? Well, you can download the NPM package. And for the next couple of weeks, you can actually enter a contest that we're running to allow you to build a ReExt app, perhaps with a grid. I would highly suggest it. And we're offering that contest through, I believe it's February 7th. I guess I don't have a slide with that on here. I believe it's February 7th. And we're awarding prizes. So the idea is, build your coolest ReExt application. There are kind of ideas and rules and parameters on our website, and we will go ahead and judge those applications, and the top 3 winners will win the prizes that you see on the screen. So we're trying to promote this. It's a new product from Sencha. It's exciting to be in the React world, and we want you guys to take advantage of it and, you know, give us some cool ideas of applications to build. So if you want more details about the ReExt contest, please check out our website. It's probably right on the homepage. So if I go to sencha.com, real quick, yeah, right up here. There's the ReExt contest. You just click on that and it'll give you all the instructions of what you need to get started. Okay. So what have we looked at? Well, we've looked at ReExt, and although I only primarily focused on a few components, a button, a data field or display field, and a grid, you have access to all of the EXT.js components. All of the visual components can be ReExt components. You can also have custom components. If you've been using EXT.js and you've built a custom grid and you have your own custom X type, those can be used within ReExt. The benefit here, especially in the React world, is that now you have a set of data-centric, performant UI components that work together. We release new releases. We make sure that all the components work and they all work with the latest releases. So that's a big benefit in that ecosystem where, you know, there are so many different components that sometimes it's hard to coordinate them together. We saw that the ReExt grid provides performance with big data through what we call a buffered store. So you can control the data retrieval and you can control how the DOM is used in that grid from a memory point of view. This is very important if you're building. I've seen a lot of applications that have many, many, many grids and many, many other data-centric things. And at that point, memory becomes an issue. I mean, my one little demo here probably could have handled all 50,000 rows, but I wanted to demonstrate in a pretty reasonable way. So you have all that control in very simple ways. And the idea here is we're giving you the ability to provide your users the best grid experience. People like this concept of infinite scrolling. I mean, it feels very natural. They don't think about, you know, is the data here, is it there? They just think about their grid of data. And now you have the ability to do that through the buffered store. Okay, with that, we've got about 15 or so minutes left. I want to turn this back for any questions that you may have. And again, I remind you, if you do have questions after the session, or you want to talk further about how you can use ReExt or the grid or anything else, please copy down my email address and send it to me, and I'd be happy to connect with you to talk further. But let's go ahead and turn it back over to our team and see what questions we have.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
My name is Raj. I'm Marketing Manager Accenture. Now let's move on to Q&A session. If you have any questions, please type them into a chat and we will address as many we can. Here we go. Let's get started. The first question we have here, does ReExt support both classic and modern toolkits?
Good question. Yeah. What I was showing you was the classic toolkit, and well, the short answer is yes. It supports both the classic and modern toolkits. The way you do that, just maybe to show you really quickly, I kind of didn't highlight this, but you'll notice here that when I create this ReExt provider in my application, I specify which toolkit. This can be classic or modern. The version can be any version 7 version. 7.8 is the latest version. The only other thing related specifically to what we were talking about is that in the classic toolkit, you use a buffered store. The modern toolkit uses something called the virtual store, but it's essentially the same thing. So if you want to build your ReExt application with the modern toolkit and you want to get these benefits, you're going to be in the documentation for the virtual store. And you'll notice up here in the documentation, there's a little toggle. Maybe I want to just see the modern documentation. Maybe I just want to see the classic, or I can see them both. So great question. Thank you. Yes, you can use both toolkits. You can also use any theme that you may want to use, any EXTJS theme. I just happen to have the classic theme here, but any of the themes that are out there, Material, Triton, Neptune, all of those themes are available as well. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. The next question is compatible with the latest versions of Next, next.js, and React?
Great. Another great question. Yes, as you noticed, let me turn this back to that first, the default that shows up when you build your application. So let me change this back to app. So if I rerun this with app, we've got a little component that we built that you can just use called the logo component. You'll notice it right here. It's just right here. So not really a functional component, but it's a component that tells you about the environment. So that logo component is currently telling me that I'm using React 18.3.1 and EXTJS 8.0.33, which is the latest. If I go over to my package.json, I have a Visual Studio Code extension that will interrogate my package.json to tell me if I'm not running the latest packages. And you'll notice, indeed, there's a new version of React. It's React 19. There are also a bunch of other things. And I can quickly update all these dependencies with a little command. Now everything is version 9, and for me to actually use those, I have to redo an npm install. So npm I, and everything's updated. If I go back and rerun this page, as you can see, I'm running version 19. Everything's working perfectly. And 7.8 is the latest, as I mentioned. So the answer is yes, we absolutely support the latest version of React. I think there was a question on next.js, which is a framework built on top of React. And yes, I think 15.1 or is the latest, something like that. We do support the latest version of Next. Any of the other server frameworks also are supported. If there's something that you're trying to use that may not be aware of, but it's React based, definitely should work. If you have any issues, let us know and we'll make sure we accommodate that. But we want to live in the ecosystem and we want to be there for you, latest and greatest. And certainly when our next version of EXTJS comes out, we're going to be ready to support that as well. So thank you.
Great. The next question, will the infinite grid or buffer store also work in regular XAS or only ReExt because of virtual DOM?
Oh, good. Well, since we made a decision to not rewrite these components, we made a decision to use the EXTJS components. So the ReExt provider that I showed you that is in the main.jsx, this ReExt provider actually loads a version of EXTJS, of the actual code that you use for EXTJS. So we're using the same components. You'll notice here that by default, the location parameter of this ReExt data is remote. So the reason I didn't have to install the SDK and do anything is because I'm using remote. And remote is, let me just bring this up here. Remote is being pulled from a CDN and is our trial version. That's why you see this EXTJS trial. But it is the underlying EXTJS component. So the answer to your question is absolutely yes. Everything I showed you is usable within EXTJS because it is EXTJS. So vice versa, if you've done something in EXTJS and you want to use React, rest assured everything you've done will work in ReExt because we wanted that to be the case. So we didn't want to have subtle anomalies. And that's why we chose to use the underlying EXTJS components.
Thank you. The next question we have, what is the process of applying theming to the grid?
Another good question. All right. You'll notice here that this theme here looks classic. I like classic. I always liked it. And that's because it is classic. It is the classic theme. Notice here it says theme classic. If I wanted to change that, let's say I wanted to change that to the material theme. I made that change and voila. Now I'm using the material theme. Now things are a lot bigger by default, the material theme, and there's different sort of UI to it. Let me try Triton. I'm going off memory here. Yeah, so there's the Triton theme. So the answer to the question is that we do have a theme property that you can set. There may be a follow-up question, or someone may be thinking, well, I've built a custom theme with EXTJS. Can I use my custom theme? And the answer is yes, you can use your custom theme. There are some rules as to how you name your theme and where you put it and how it gets working. I will let you guys know that my colleague Andres has done an excellent webinar series where he's building an app with ReExt, and I know one of the topics is providing a custom theme. So I would point you to that webinar series to get further information on that. But absolutely, we support all the themes and custom themes in both classic and modern.
Great, thank you. The next question, will ReExt support the upcoming XAS 7.9 release?
Yes, we've already done some cursory testing. We purposely architected ReExt to be very nominal. I mean, it only has a couple of props, as you saw, and unless we do something substantial to the architecture, which we aren't doing at the moment in EXTJS, then yes, absolutely. But we plan on providing support for 7.9 and any further versions of the moment they come out. So latest version of React, latest version of any React framework, latest version of EXTJS. We only go back as far as version 7 because that's the earliest version we support. but we will support you in any version 7, latest included.
Awesome. This is incredible. So that wraps up our presentation for today.
Great, great. Well, I hope this has given you some inspiration, and you still have enough time to join the contest. We'd love to see you. If you have questions or you want to dive into this further as to how this would work in your organization, that's what I'm here for. Just send me an email, and this will be recorded, or is being recorded, and should be available soon. But we look forward to hearing from you, and wish you guys good luck with ReExt. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you for joining us and for your time. Best of luck with the contest. Exciting cash prizes to win. Thank you all.